Subscribe our channel for more videos.
In the spring of 1940, the most powerful air marshal in the world read a single intelligence report, laughed out loud, and threw it in the trash. That decision would kill the Third Reich. The report described an American plan to build 50,000 warplanes a year. Hermann Göring, the man who commanded the most feared air force on Earth, found it so ridiculous he couldn't stop smiling. 50,000 planes, from a country that couldn't even field 2,000 combat-ready aircraft, from a nation of car salesmen and jazz musicians and Hollywood actors. The Americans, Göring told his staff, understood nothing about real war. Let them try. Let them embarrass themselves. 4 years later, a single American factory was outproducing his entire air force, and Göring died knowing it. This is the story of the most catastrophic miscalculation in military history. It is the story of a nation that looked impossible in the face and said, "Hold my coffee." It is the story of women who had never touched a rivet gun, producing aircraft with greater precision than Germany's finest engineers. It is the story of how a democratic nation of free citizens, united by fury and purpose, buried the most fearsome military machine the world had ever seen under an avalanche of aluminum and steel. And it is the story of one arrogant man's laughter that echoed all the way to his execution. Sit down, because what you're about to hear will change the way you look at history forever. To understand why Göring laughed, you have to understand what the world looked like in the spring of 1940, because from where he was sitting, in the gilded offices of the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin, the future belonged to Germany. It was May of 1940, and the German Wehrmacht was doing something no military force had achieved in over a century. It was dismantling France. Not slowly, not methodically, it was tearing it apart like paper. German panzers were pouring through the Ardennes, bypassing the Maginot Line entirely and racing toward the English Channel at speeds that left Allied commanders frozen in disbelief. In Britain, Winston Churchill had just taken office and was already staring down the barrel of national annihilation. In Paris, government officials were burning classified documents in the courtyard of the Foreign Ministry. The smoke rising from those fires was visible across the Seine. This was the world Göring inhabited, a world where German military genius appeared invincible, where Blitzkrieg had rewritten the laws of warfare in a matter of weeks, where the Luftwaffe had ruled the skies over Poland, over Norway, over France, with a ruthlessness that left opposing air forces shattered on their own runways. Göring had built the Luftwaffe from nothing. It was his creation, his masterpiece, his monument to German superiority. When he walked into a room, men who commanded armies stood up straighter. He wore medals the way other men wore shirts. He was operatic, theatrical, intoxicated with power, and absolutely, completely certain that no nation on earth could challenge what Germany had built. And then his intelligence officer placed a document on his desk. Franklin Roosevelt had just addressed a joint session of Congress. The American president, his face serious behind those round spectacles, had delivered a speech that electrified Washington and stunned the world. He stood at that podium on May 16, 1940, with German tanks still accelerating through French countryside, and he looked directly into the eyes of every American who would hear those words, and he said something that seemed almost delusional. He said he wanted this nation to produce 50,000 military aircraft per year. 50,000. The room went silent. Then it buzzed with the particular sound of people trying to figure out if they had heard correctly. In 1939, the entire United States had produced 3,611 military aircraft. The Army Air Corps, the fighting force tasked with defending America from the sky, possessed roughly 1,700 combat planes, and a disturbing number of those were already obsolete, designs that belonged to another era, machines that German pilots would have torn to pieces in open combat.
Roosevelt wasn't asking for a modest increase. He wasn't proposing a sensible expansion program. He was demanding a 14-fold multiplication of production in a country that had no wartime industrial infrastructure, no dedicated bomber plants, no economy geared for anything except recovering from the worst economic depression in modern history. Even America's closest allies thought he'd lost his mind. Göring read the report, he set it down, and he laughed. He told his staff that the Americans were desperate, that their propaganda would frighten no one in Berlin, that building warplanes was not like building automobiles, that it required precision and expertise and a warrior culture that America simply did not possess. He said they would try to convert their car factories and they would learn their lesson. He was contemptuous, dismissive, theatrical in his mockery. The man who laughed at the idea of 50,000 American planes per year went back to his maps and his plans and his magnificent certainty, and he didn't give the matter another serious thought. This was his fatal mistake. Not just a military blunder, not just a strategic error. It was a failure of imagination so complete, so total, so catastrophically absolute that it altered the course of human civilization. Because while Göring was laughing in Berlin, something extraordinary was already happening in Detroit. His name was William Knutson, and he was a Dane who had fallen in love with America the moment he stepped off the boat. He had arrived with nothing, built himself into one of the most respected industrial minds in the world, risen to become the president of General Motors, and was earning $300,000 a year at a time when most Americans were struggling to put food on their tables. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, quiet in the way that genuinely powerful people often are, with hands that looked like they actually built things because they had. Knutson understood manufacturing the way some men understand music, intuitively, in his bones, at a level that went beyond theory into pure instinct. When Roosevelt's advisors were asked who could possibly achieve this production miracle, presidential counselor Bernard Baruch gave an answer that needed no elaboration whatsoever. First, Bill Knutson. Second, Bill Knutson. Third, Bill Knutson. Knutson walked away from his $300,000 salary to work for the United States government for $1 a year. $1. He took the title of production chief and he went to work with the quiet, unstoppable intensity of a man who understood exactly what was at stake. He was not a soldier. He would never fire a gun in anger. But what William Knutson was about to do in the factories of America would prove more decisive than any battle fought on any front in the entire war. He began immediately. He walked into automotive plants and aircraft facilities, and he started asking the questions that no one else had thought of. He looked at the way Boeing built bombers and the way Ford built cars, and he started to see connections, pathways, possibilities that others had missed. Aircraft manufacturers had always treated their work as a form of artistry, each plane assembled almost individually by skilled craftsmen who took enormous pride in their work. It was beautiful, and it was precise, and it was fatally, catastrophically slow. Knutson looked at this system and he saw a bottleneck that could lose the war before it started.
He didn't just want to build more planes, he wanted to rebuild the entire concept of how planes were built. By December of 1941, before America had even officially entered the war, the fruits of Knutson's obsessive planning were already visible. American factories were producing 2,000 military aircraft every single month. That was a 20-fold increase from 2 years earlier, 20 times in 24 months. Companies that had never built a single aircraft were retooling their production lines, hiring engineers, training workers, converting machinery. The arsenal of democracy wasn't just awakening, it was stretching its enormous limbs and beginning to understand its own strength. But the true test was still coming, and it would be built on a piece of Michigan farmland that no one had ever heard of: Willow Run. The name would become legendary, but in April of 1941, it was just a patch of flat farmland outside Ypsilanti, Michigan, notable for nothing except its proximity to Ford Motor Company's vast industrial empire.
Charles Sorensen, Ford's brilliant and brutal production chief, stood on that farmland and made a promise that even his own colleagues thought was insane. He said Ford would build a plant there, the largest factory under a single roof in the history of the world, and that plant would produce one B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every single hour. Not every day, not every shift, every hour. The B-24 Liberator was not a simple machine. It was a technological marvel of its era, a massive four-engine heavy bomber built from 488,193 individual parts. Nearly 500,000 components had to be manufactured to precise tolerances, assembled in the correct sequence, tested for function, and integrated into an aircraft that then had to survive the most hostile environment imaginable, flying through flak-filled skies at high altitude while enemy fighters tried to tear it apart. Other factories were managing one per day and considering themselves accomplished. Sorensen was promising one per hour. The construction of Willow Run was itself a feat of almost incomprehensible ambition. The plant consumed 3.5 million square feet under a single roof. Its assembly line stretched for a full mile. Workers who entered one end of the building and walked its length without stopping would cover a distance equivalent to a significant morning jog. The building was so large that it had its own weather systems, pockets of fog forming near the ceiling on cold mornings. When it was finished, it was the single largest room in human history. Then they tried to actually build bombers in it, and for a while it was a disaster. The first B-24 rolled off the Willow Run line in September of 1942, and it required complete rebuilding before it could fly. Quality control failures were running at 50%. Half the components coming off the line were defective. By February of 1943, months after Sorensen's triumphant promises, the plant was producing just 56 bombers per month. Critics were merciless. They called it "Will it run?" The press was savage. Congressional investigators descended on the facility. The whole enterprise looked like the most expensive industrial failure in American history. But inside that enormous building, something was happening that the critics couldn't see yet. Ford engineers, many of them the same men who had revolutionized automobile manufacturing in the previous decade, were doing what American engineers did when facing an impossible problem. They were taking it apart. Literally, they broke the B-24's production process into sub-assemblies, discrete manufacturing tasks that could be performed simultaneously by teams of workers who didn't need to understand the whole aircraft, only their piece of it. They developed hydraulic riveting tools that drove fasteners faster and more precisely than any human hand. They designed prefabricated wiring harnesses that could be installed in minutes rather than hours. They engineered a moving assembly line, the same principle Henry Ford had applied to automobiles a generation earlier, now applied to the most complex machine humanity had yet built. They accommodated 578 design changes in 1943 alone. Think about that. The aircraft they were building was being redesigned, modified, improved, updated 578 times in a single year, and they kept the line moving. When combat reports came back from the Pacific or Europe indicating a vulnerability or a needed modification, Ford's engineers translated that information into production changes within weeks. German aircraft manufacturers, locked in rigid hierarchical systems with slave labor forces who had no incentive to report problems, took months or years to implement similar changes. American workers, free citizens with a direct stake in the outcome, absorbed modifications and kept moving. By September of 1943, Willow Run was producing 148 bombers per month. By December, 365. And then came April of 1944, the month that sealed Hermann Göring's fate. In April of 1944, the Willow Run plant produced 428 B-24 Liberator heavy bombers. That was one complete four-engine heavy bomber built from 488,193 individual parts, rolling off the line every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Sorensen had promised one per hour. he had delivered. One factory on a piece of Michigan farmland that had been growing soybeans 3 years earlier was outproducing the entire German aviation industry. And Willow Run was only one of dozens of plants operating at similar scales. Boeing's Seattle facility was producing 16 B-17 Flying Fortresses every single day by May of 1944. North American Aviation was manufacturing 500 P-51 Mustangs per month, arguably the finest fighter aircraft produced by any nation during the entire war. Lockheed was achieving 1 P-38 Lightning every 90 minutes while simultaneously implementing 2,127 combat-driven modifications to the design. Douglas Aircraft, which had employed just 68 people in 1936, had grown to 160,000 workers across 9 separate facilities. The numbers weren't just impressive, they were mathematically surreal. General Motors, the company that gave Knudsen to America for $1 a year, produced 56,658 aircraft engines under license. Packard built 55,523 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same engine that powered the Spitfire, now manufactured in quantities that made British production look modest. Alcoa, the aluminum company, increased its output by 600%. Dow Chemical's magnesium production grew from 6 million pounds annually to 333 million pounds. Every supporting industry in America had caught the same fever, the same obsessive, competitive, patriotic drive to produce more, faster, better. The workforce that achieved all of this would have stunned the Nazi theorists most deeply of all. In 1941, women represented less than 1% of workers in American aircraft factories. By 1943, they represented 65%. 310,000 women were working in aircraft production, and they were not struggling, they were excelling. At Douglas's Long Beach facility, 22,841 employees were women. Rose Monroe, who became the real-life inspiration for the iconic Rosie the Riveter image, was driving 3,000 rivets per shift at Willow Run with a 99.5% accuracy rate. Let that number settle for a moment. 99.5% accuracy on 3,000 rivets every single shift in an aircraft that would fly through combat.
Women inspectors at Douglas reduced the facility's defect rate from 3.2% to 0.3%. Ford's engineers, designing tools for workers with smaller hands, inadvertently discovered that lighter pneumatic tools reduced fatigue across all workers and increased overall efficiency. Better positioned workstations decreased injury rates. Every adaptation made in response to a diverse workforce turned out to make the entire operation more effective. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe intelligence was filing reports that dismissed female aircraft workers as signs of American desperation. A captured German intelligence document, recovered after the war, predicted that quality would collapse as women flooded the factories. These analysts, working within a system built on rigid hierarchical assumptions about human capability, simply could not process the data they were receiving. They saw what they expected to see, which was weakness. They were looking directly at strength and calling it by the wrong name. This was the Nazi system's deepest flaw, not its brutality, though the brutality was real and monstrous, its fundamental inability to see clearly, to assess the world as it was rather than as ideology demanded it to be. General Friedrich von Boedeker had been Germany's military attaché in Washington from 1933 to 1941. He was an intelligent man, a careful observer, and he had spent years watching American industry with growing alarm. His reports back to Berlin were detailed, accurate, and increasingly urgent. In December of 1940, he sent a cable that should have set alarm bells ringing in every office of the Reich. American war production, he warned, would reach heights that were, in his exact words, unimaginable. Berlin dismissed him as a defeatist. When Boedeker personally met Hitler in February of 1939 to present his assessments of American industrial potential, he found himself unable to complete a coherent briefing. Hitler didn't want to hear analysis, he wanted to deliver a monologue about American racial degeneracy. He ranted about Americans being half Judaized and half Negrified, incapable of sustained military effort, a nation of mongrels incapable of the iron discipline that great military production required. The Führer talked for 90 minutes and listened for approximately none. Baedeker left the meeting having failed to communicate a single substantive fact. This was the structural catastrophe at the heart of Nazi Germany's intelligence failure. The system was designed to tell Hitler what he wanted to hear. Reports that confirmed his worldview rose to his desk. Reports that challenged it were filtered out, softened, buried, or simply ignored by officers who understood that delivering unwelcome news to Adolf Hitler was a career-ending and sometimes life-ending experience. The greatest intelligence apparatus in Europe was systematically blinded by a single man's ideological vanity. And so, when the reality finally arrived, it arrived not as a warning, but as a physical force, a wall of aircraft that darkened the sky over Germany and would not stop coming no matter how many fighters were thrown against it. German pilots knew the truth before their commanders admitted it. Major Johannes Steinhoff was commanding JG-77 during the Tunisia campaign in December of 1942. Steinhoff was not a man easily impressed. He was an extraordinarily skilled pilot with extensive combat experience, a man who had faced excellent Soviet and British aviators and prevailed. When he wrote about the Americans he was now encountering in the skies over North Africa, his words carried a weight that no intelligence report had managed to convey to Berlin. The American pilots, he noted in his journal, were no longer amateurs. They were flying with skill and confidence. They were adapting quickly. And most disturbing of all, there were more of them every day. Not slightly more, noticeably, undeniably, frighteningly more. The revelation deepened through 1943 as American production hit its stride and American pilots gained experience. On January 27, 1943, American bombers struck Germany for the first time. It was a modest raid, 64 aircraft attacking the port of Wilhelmshaven, but it announced something that Germans from the Führer to the factory worker would spend the next 2 years dreading. The Americans were not going to stay on their side of the ocean. They were coming, and they were bringing their factories with them in the form of endless, relentless, maddening streams of aircraft that replaced losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The mathematics became undeniable during the catastrophic mission to Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, the day that became known as Black Thursday. The 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17s deep into Germany to bomb the ball-bearing factories that fed virtually every mechanical system in the Wehrmacht. German fighters tore into the formation with ferocity and skill. When the surviving bombers landed in England that afternoon, 60 of them were missing, and the crews of many more would never fly again. It was the worst single-day loss in American bomber history. But Göring, receiving the reports of this triumph that evening, missed the most important number. America replaced those 60 bombers in under 2 weeks. Not eventually, not after a painful production delay. Within 14 days, the gaps in the formation had closed. The mission went on. The campaign continued. The attrition war that Germany needed to win the air battle could not be won because the mathematics were fundamentally inverted. Germany was shooting down American aircraft faster than it could produce fighters. America was producing bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. These two curves, one climbing and one falling, crossed somewhere over the skies of Europe in late 1943, and after they crossed, the air war was effectively over, even though it would continue for another year and a half. General Adolf Galland, arguably Germany's finest fighter commander, a man who had earned the Knight's Cross with diamonds and oak leaves and still managed to be respected by the very men he was trying to kill, laid out the situation with brutal clarity in a report to Göring in early 1944. Germany was losing 1,200 fighters per month. It was producing 1,000. America was producing 2,500 fighters per month and losing 400. The deficit was not a problem to be managed, it was a death sentence being carried out in slow motion.
Göring's response to this report was to accuse his pilots of cowardice. It was the response of a man who could no longer afford to believe what mathematics was telling him. Miser Heinz Baer had 220 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of the highest-scoring fighter pilots in history. In January of 1944, he led a German fighter formation against an American bomber stream approaching Brunswick. What he saw over Germany that morning would stay with him for the rest of his life. The bomber stream stretched, in his words, from horizon to horizon. He counted at least 700 flying fortresses and liberators, moving in the terrible, majestic, inexorable way of something too large to be stopped by ordinary means. His formation numbered 8 aircraft against a wall of 700. They flew into that formation and they fought with everything they had, and when it was over, the bombers flew on and Germany burned a little more. It was hopeless, Baer said afterwards. The word carries more weight when spoken by a man who had spent years finding hope in hopeless situations.
Big Week, the massive Allied air campaign that ran from February 20th to February 25th, 1944, demonstrated what American production superiority looked like when it was concentrated and directed. The 8th and 15th Air Forces mounted 3,500 bomber sorties in 6 days, targeting German aircraft production facilities across the Reich. The Luftwaffe responded with everything it had, and what it lost it could never get back. Between 262 and 355 German fighters were destroyed in 6 days of combat. More critically, approximately 100 experienced veteran German pilots were killed, men who had spent years accumulating the combat knowledge that turned good pilots into great ones, men who represented an investment in training and experience that could not be replaced on any schedule. Veteran pilots were a finite resource. American production was not. By 1944, the numbers had crossed so far beyond any reasonable military calculation that they had entered the territory of historical inevitability. In that single year, American factories produced 96,270 aircraft, not over the course of the war, in 1 year. That production included 16,048 four-engine heavy bombers, 35,743 fighters, and 22,591 multi-engine aircraft of various types. The total for that single year exceeded Germany's entire production across the whole of the war, which amounted to approximately 94,677 aircraft. America built more planes in 1944 than Germany built from 1939 to 1945. And America was simultaneously fighting Japan. The quality advantages compounded the quantity advantages in ways that made the situation even more lopsided than the raw numbers suggested. Each American bomber carried 13 50-caliber machine guns with thousands of rounds of ammunition. German fighters were increasingly launching with partial ammunition loads because supply chains were breaking down. American bombers were equipped with powered turrets, sophisticated Norden bomb sights accurate enough to put a bomb through a specific building from 25,000 feet, and advanced navigation equipment that allowed operations in weather that grounded German defenders. German fighters, by the end of 1944, frequently lacked functioning radios. The gap was not just in numbers, it was in every dimension of military capability simultaneously. The B-29 Superfortress told a particular story about American technological ambition. The most advanced bomber ever built, featuring pressurized cabins, remote-controlled gun turrets operated by gunners using analog computers, a range that could carry war to Japan from bases in the Pacific, and a payload capacity that would eventually make it history's most destructive individual weapons platform. Each B-29 cost $600,000 in 1940s dollars. The entire B-29 program cost more than the Manhattan Project. By early 1945, America was producing 100 of them per month. Germany's answer to American superiority was supposed to be the Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, and it was genuinely terrifying to encounter. At speeds 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied piston-engine fighter, it could slash through bomber formations before gunners could track it properly. When it worked, it was a revelation of future warfare. Hitler and Göring believed it was their wonder weapon, the technological miracle that could restore the air-war balance regardless of the production gap. But Germany produced only 1,430 Me-262s in total. At no point were more than 200 operational simultaneously. The engines required complete overhaul every 10 hours of flying time, and the critical raw materials for those engines were increasingly unavailable, forcing substitutions with inferior alloys that degraded performance and shortened operational life further. Veteran pilot training for jet aircraft took time that Germany no longer had. Airfields capable of handling jets were prime targets for American bombers that seemed to know everything and be everywhere simultaneously. Here was the final devastating truth that Germany could not escape. Technological superiority without the industrial base to deploy it at scale is a curiosity, not a weapon. Germany had invented the jet age and couldn't afford to fight in it. America, meanwhile, had begun its own jet development in 1942. The Bell P-59 Aerocomet proved inferior to German jets, and the Americans knew it immediately, scrapped it as a frontline fighter, and moved on. Lockheed's P-80 Shooting Star, genuinely superior to any German jet aircraft in overall performance, entered production before the war ended. America could pursue jet technology simultaneously with producing 100,000 conventional aircraft per year because America had the depth, the capacity, the human and industrial capital to do many impossible things at once. This was the nature of the miracle that Göring had laughed at. It was not just production, it was the entirety of a free society operating at the absolute maximum of its capability. Millions of individual human beings, each making their own choices to give everything they had, none of them forced, none of them enslaved, all of them pulled forward by the same terrible knowledge that the alternative to winning was losing everything. The workforce that built the arsenal of democracy represented every strand of the American story. 2 million Americans worked in aircraft production at the peak. They were women who had never touched industrial machinery in their lives. They were African Americans working in factories that hadn't previously hired them, bringing the same talent and determination to riveting and inspection and tool operation that they had always possessed and had never been permitted to fully express. They were Mexican Americans and Native Americans and recent immigrants and teenagers who had dropped out of high school to help build the machines that would bring their fathers and brothers home. They were elderly men who had retired and came back, and disabled workers who found that their particular limitations mattered far less than their particular skills. Democratic mobilization, voluntary and diverse, and unified by purpose rather than coercion, proved superior to totalitarian command by every metric that could be measured. Productivity per American worker increased 300% between 1941 and 1945. Productivity per German worker declined after 1943. Slave labor, which the Nazi regime had come to rely upon at catastrophic scale, was the single most counterproductive economic decision in the history of industrial warfare. Slaves sabotage, slaves work slowly, slaves have no investment in quality. The underground Mittelwerk complex, which forced 60,000 concentration camp prisoners to work in horrific conditions, with 20,000 of them dying, produced more defects than functional components. The entire Mittelwerk complex, with its 60,000 enslaved workers, produced fewer aircraft engines per month than Ford's single plant in Chicago. The feedback loops that America had built into its production system were invisible to German observers, but decisive in their effect. When combat over Europe revealed that the B-17 was vulnerable to head-on attacks because the nose lacked sufficient armament, Boeing's engineers received that information and added chin turrets to the design within 60 days. Not 60 months, 60 days, and the modified aircraft were coming off the line. When Pacific operations demonstrated that extended range was critical, consolidated modified B-24 production to increase fuel capacity without stopping the line. When Lockheed received 2,127 modifications to the P-38 Lightning based on combat experience, they implemented them while maintaining production schedules. Information flowed from combat zones to production facilities to design offices and back to production in days. It moved freely because the people involved were free, because a factory worker who noticed an improvement could tell his foreman, who could tell an engineer, who could tell a designer, because no one was afraid to be the person who identified a problem or proposed a solution. German production in underground facilities run by slave labor under SS supervision, with designers isolated from combat feedback and engineers afraid to challenge specifications from above, had no such mechanism. German aircraft became increasingly static as the war progressed. American aircraft evolved continuously. By 1944, the P-51 Mustang that escorted bombers to Berlin was a fundamentally different machine than it had been entering production 2 years earlier.
June 6, 1944. D-Day. The final demonstration. When Allied forces crossed the English Channel and hit the beaches of Normandy, they did so under an air umbrella that numbered 11,590 aircraft. The Luftwaffe managed 319 sorties that day. Not 319 aircraft, 319 individual sorties, many of them flown by aircraft that appeared once, briefly, and then fled rather than contest the skies above the invasion fleet. The ratio was 36-1. This was not tactical air superiority. This was industrial annihilation. The physical expression of 3 years of Willow Run and Seattle and Long Beach and Ypsilanti translated into a wall of aircraft so thick that German pilots who flew near the invasion area described it as looking up at a solid ceiling of wings. The preparatory bombing campaign that preceded D-Day had already dropped 145,000 tons of bombs on German targets in the 5 months before the invasion. That exceeded the entire German bombing campaign against Britain across the full duration of the war. Britain had endured the Blitz, had suffered, had bent but not broken, and the Americans had repaid that horror with interest compounded daily. German industry, already shrinking under the weight of sustained strategic bombing, was being systematically dismantled from the air. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister and perhaps the most capable administrator the Nazi regime produced, later testified under oath that American strategic bombing had reduced German tank production by 35%, aircraft production by 31%, and truck production by 42%. He stated without equivocation that the American attacks, which followed a definite system of assault on industrial targets, caused the breakdown of the German armament system. This was not Allied propaganda. This was the man who had run German war production, speaking at Nuremberg, telling the court exactly why they had lost. By December of 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge marked Germany's last desperate attempt to reverse the tide of ground combat, single American air raids involved 1,200 bombers escorted by 900 fighters.
The P-51 Mustangs that flew escort could reach Poland and return. They could match any German fighter in performance, and they existed in numbers that made the concept of air superiority a joke. Because air superiority requires controlling the sky, and you cannot control the sky when the enemy is producing 2,500 fighters a month and losing 400, while you are producing 1,000 and losing 1,200. German pilots, the extraordinary, courageous, increasingly doomed young men who kept climbing into their cockpits as the odds became unsurvivable, gave the P-51 Mustang a name. They called them Indians because they swarmed everywhere, appeared from every direction, and no matter how many you drove off, there were always more coming. Even the Nazi leadership, in their private moments, had begun to acknowledge what they could not say publicly. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister who had built his career on making falsehoods sound like truth, wrote in his private diary in December of 1944 that Göring's promises about Luftwaffe superiority now seemed like criminal delusions. He wrote that Germany was fighting the world's greatest industrial power with nothing but rhetoric. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the man who had nearly driven the British out of North Africa and had been considered the most gifted field commander in the Wehrmacht, told his staff before D-Day that the Americans would come with such material superiority that no defensive position could hold. He calculated that America could lose 10 tanks for every one Germany destroyed and still overwhelm the German army by simple arithmetic. And Hitler himself, in his bunker in January of 1945, as Soviet forces closed on Berlin and American bombs fell daily on what remained of German industry, admitted to Albert Speer something he would never have said 3 years earlier. We should have listened to Bottcher's reports. Their industrial potential was decisive. While we built hundreds, they built tens of thousands. The man who had ranted to Bottcher about American racial degeneracy had lived to see that degeneracy produce 295,959 military aircraft against his nation's 94,777. Hermann Göring was arrested on May 8, 1945, by soldiers of the U.S. 36th Infantry Division. The man who had commanded the most feared air force in history, the Reich Marshal who had dismissed 50,000 American planes as impossible propaganda, was taken into custody peacefully, with 17 pieces of luggage and a collection of paracodeine pills that indicated the narcotic dependency that had grown alongside his imperial pretensions. He was transferred to Camp Ashcan in Luxembourg, a facility specifically designed for high-ranking Nazi prisoners, and there the interrogations began. Major Kenneth Heckler conducted extensive interviews with Göring over the summer of 1945, carefully documenting the Reich Marshal's evolving confrontation with the facts of his defeat. Göring was a man of powerful intelligence and even more powerful ego, and both were engaged in a struggle to process what had happened. He was still capable of arrogance in those sessions. He still maintained, initially, that German technology was superior, that German pilots were braver, that the Luftwaffe was a magnificent instrument diminished only by numbers. But the numbers would not leave him alone. When Heckler presented him with statistics on production, when he laid out the charts showing monthly output figures, when he described the Willow Run facility and what it had achieved, Göring's defenses began to fail. "I knew American industrial potential was great," he told Heckler in one of those sessions. "That single factory at Willow Run produced more aircraft than our entire bomber force at peak." He paused, searching for words adequate to what he was trying to express. "It was incomprehensible," he said finally. He was particularly undone by American logistics, by the fact that a nation had supplied and sustained massive armies and air forces fighting simultaneously on opposite sides of the planet, across supply lines measured in thousands of miles, while maintaining domestic production at record levels and raising the standard of living for its working people. Your ability to supply forces across 2 oceans while maintaining domestic production, this was beyond our conception. We couldn't adequately supply forces 500 miles from Germany. You supplied armies 5,000 miles from America. At Nuremberg, prosecutors showed Göring films of Willow Run. They showed him the assembly line moving, the bombers emerging one by one, an endless mechanical procession of the aircraft that killed his pilots and burned his cities and broke his empire. They showed him charts comparing monthly American production to German annual totals. They showed him the numbers for aircraft engines. America had produced 812,615 against 241,775. The ratio was almost exactly the same across every category of military production. Prison psychologist Gustav Gilbert spent considerable time with Göring during the Nuremberg proceedings and documented his mental state carefully. Gilbert noted that Göring had become obsessed with production statistics, that he repeatedly worked through the calculations, comparing single American factories to entire German production districts. He seemed particularly fixated on Willow Run, returning to it repeatedly in conversation. He called it, in Gilbert's record, that damned factory that broke our backs. When shown the engine production numbers, the 812,615 against 241,775, Göring said nothing. He simply stared at the figures in silence. The silence lasted long enough that Gilbert noted it specifically, because Göring was not a man given to silence. The transformation whose product had silenced him was genuinely staggering in its scope. America began the war with 3,611 military aircraft produced in 1940. By the end, American factories had built 295,959 total aircraft, including 97,810 bombers, 99,465 fighters, and 98,684 aircraft of other types. 2 million Americans had worked in aircraft production. They had entered those factories in 1941 knowing nothing about aviation manufacturing. They had emerged in 1945 as the most skilled industrial workforce the world had ever produced.
The innovations they developed did not stay in the factories. Statistical quality control, developed to manage bomber production, became standard industrial practice worldwide. The automation principles pioneered at Willow Run transformed global manufacturing. The engineers who had designed bomber assembly lines would go on to design the Saturn V rocket. The women who drove rivets into B-24 Liberators would raise children who walked on the moon. The production miracle had not ended with victory. It had created the technological and industrial foundation for everything that followed. The financial dimensions of the achievement defied the economic orthodoxy of every era that has tried to analyze them. Aircraft production alone consumed the equivalent of $800 billion in today's currency. The war turned an economy still healing from the Great Depression into the most productive industrial system in history. Unemployment, which had consumed a decade, vanished completely. Personal income doubled between 1940 and 1945. Willow Run workers alone purchased $45 million in war bonds, directly financing the expansion of the factory where they worked. Free workers, choosing to invest their own wages in their own production capacity, demonstrated a form of voluntary industrial mobilization that no command economy has ever replicated. On the night of October 15, 1946, hours before his scheduled execution at Nuremberg, Hermann Göring wrote a final letter. In it, he made the most complete and honest assessment he had ever committed to paper. The Americans won through industrial power, not military prowess. We were not defeated by better soldiers, but by better factories. The nation we dismissed as capable only of building consumer goods buried the Wehrmacht under aluminum and steel. And his final recorded words to Gilbert, delivered that same evening,
carried the weight of a man who had finally run out of escape routes. We declared war on an industrial giant while it slept. When it awoke, we were doomed. They didn't just outproduce us, they revolutionized production itself. Every aspect of their system proved superior to ours. That night, Hermann Göring swallowed a cyanide capsule that his guards had somehow missed. He died before the hangman could reach him, but his testimony stands. The man who had laughed at the idea of 50,000 American planes, who had dismissed the intelligence reports, who had told his staff that the Americans understood nothing of war production, died knowing that a single American factory had exceeded his entire Air Force's lifetime production, and that the democratic nation he had mocked had responded to his mockery by building twice the number of aircraft that had made him laugh. The B-24 Liberator bombers that rolled off Willow Run's assembly line every 63 minutes were not just aircraft, they were arguments. Arguments made in aluminum and steel and hydraulic rivets driven by women who had been housewives. Arguments built by teenagers who had left high school to serve something larger than themselves. Arguments assembled by workers who had fled poverty and discrimination and found in those factory floors a democratic dignity that no ideology of racial superiority could touch. Each one that flew was a refutation. Each one that dropped its bombs was a demonstration. Each one that came home was proof. Roosevelt asked for 50,000 planes. America built nearly 300,000. Göring laughed. History answered. Military historians have reached a consensus that American production was the decisive factor in Allied victory. Without it, D-Day does not happen. The strategic bombing campaign is not sustained. The Pacific War is not winnable on any timeline that Western civilization could endure. Richard Overy, whose work on the Air War represents the highest standard of historical scholarship, concluded that the outcome was determined not by fighting spirit or tactical brilliance, but by the weight of material. The Allies won because they buried their enemies under an avalanche of production. The numbers do not merely support this conclusion, they demand it. But the meaning of the production miracle reaches beyond military history, beyond casualty counts and production statistics, and the geopolitical consequences of Allied victory. It is a story about what free people can do when they understand what they are fighting for. It is a story about the difference between a system that motivates and a system that coerces. It is a story about a nation that looked at an impossible number and decided the number was too small. It is a story about women who were told their proper place was the home and responded by building the aircraft that saved the world. It is a story about immigrants who loved their adopted country more than their adopted country had always loved them back and who served it anyway. Hermann Göring's contempt for American production capacity was not just a military mistake, it was a philosophical error of the most fundamental kind. He believed that free, diverse, democratic people were inherently weaker than disciplined, homogeneous, ideologically unified ones. He believed this because his entire worldview required him to believe it, and America's response to his belief was 295,959 aircraft. The leaders of every era would do well to remember what happened to the last man who made that mistake. Göring dismissed a peaceful, prosperous, pluralistic democracy as incapable of sustained industrial effort. He confused preference for peace with inability to fight. He mistook diversity for weakness. He interpreted the absence of conquest as evidence of incapacity. And the democracy he dismissed woke from its peace and converted its prosperity into the most overwhelming military production in human history. And it did so faster than he had believed was physically possible. And it sustained that production for 4 years while simultaneously raising the living standards of the workers who achieved it. The Third Reich built 94,677 aircraft across 6 years of total war, using the labor of slaves, the resources of a continent, and the coerced effort of an entire nation. America built 295,959 in 4 years, using free workers who chose their work, earning wages that doubled their incomes, buying war bonds that funded their own factories, and going home each night to families they expected to see again. Democracy built 3 times as many planes as fascism. Free workers outproduced slaves in every category by every metric across every year of the war. And the man who had laughed at the idea of 50,000 planes died in a prison cell haunted by a factory in Michigan that he hadn't been able to think about since the moment he heard about it. That damned factory that broke our backs. That factory, that miracle, that answer. If this story moved you the way history at its most powerful is supposed to move you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below, because the stories in those comment sections, the connections you make between this history and the present, are part of why we tell these stories. Subscribe because there are thousands of these stories waiting to be told. Stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stories that the history books summarize in a paragraph and that deserve an hour. The arsenal of democracy proved something in those 4 years that no propaganda campaign ever could. It proved it with 295,959 aircraft. And Göring's laughter is still echoing.